السلام عليكم.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وسبحان الله العلي العظيم، والحمد لله رب العالمين، نحمده ونستعينه ونستهديه ونسترضيه ونستنصره، فإنه حق من هدى الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له. ونصلي ونسلم ونبارك على الحبيب المصطفى محمد النبي الأمين المرسل رحمة للعالمين، خاتم الرسل والأنبياء أجمعين، وعلى آله الأطهار الميامين، وعلى أصحابه المختارين. اللهم يا رب العالمين، يا رحمن يا رحيم، اللهم اهدنا فيمن هديت، وعافنا فيمن عافيت، وتولنا فيمن توليت، وقنا واصرف عنا شر ما قضيت. فإنك سبحانك تقضي ولا يقضى عليك، وإنه يا ربنا لا يذل من واليت ولا يعز من عاديت. تباركت يا ربنا وتعاليت. Subhanallah, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instructs us, educates us, attempts to guide us, so often God tells us in the Quran very simple, straightforward, but yet earth-shattering and utterly overwhelming command, instruction, education, when Allah keeps insisting, وَأَحْسِنُوا فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ يُحِبُّ الْمُحْسِنِينَ. Time and time again, it is not just that you need to be a Muslim or identify as a Muslim. And it is not sufficient that you even be a believer or a mu'min. But taqwa itself, piety itself, needs to manifest in that very simple principle of ahsinu. For Allah loves the muhsineen. And ahsinu, the best way to translate it or even understand it is be beautifully good. Be beautiful in all you do and all you say. Excel in beauty. Excel in manifesting beauty. Embody what is beautiful. وَأَحْسِنُوا. It is not an abstract principle, and no amount of philosophizing can do it justice. It is an active principle. It is a principle of engagement in real life. To always be good. But the very nature of goodness is situational. It is always, by definition, contextual. if you live in a world in which you need a car to transport you, and what I make available to you is a donkey, you need a car to get around, and I present you with a donkey. That is not ihsan. It is, yes, I've presented you with something good, but contextually, relationally, in context, the presentation of a donkey might have been an adequate fulfillment of an obligation to do good at some time under certain circumstances, but not the circumstances that we confront. So, for instance, if what you need is an education, if what people need is literacy and an educational program that develops their intelligence and their ability to think and their ability to analyze, and I come and I present you with a means to attend parties and sing and dance, am I among the muhsineen? Yes, I offered you something, but contextually, relationally, I offered you nothing. The very principle of ihsan, and when Allah says, Allah loves those who do what is beautifully good. And when Allah says, do what is beautifully good, by definition, it is relational. It is contextual. In a certain day and a certain age, when there were no police force and no means of mass communication, when the risk factor to human safety often dictated and mandated highly patriarchal societies, because women outside their home, living at a time in which there is no means to call for help, no means of communication, in which there is no system of social safety or social security, quite often, in that day and age, the beautiful thing, the beautiful act, was to ensure women of male protection. So the fact that you command men to dedicate themselves to the physical safety of women was considered an act of ihsan. But in a different day and age, where in fact the very nature of social life has changed, and women are not dependent on male physical protection. The very commands that represented goodness once upon a time now become oppressive and degrading to women. If you tell a woman today that the overriding principle is that you must exist in the shadow of male protection, that is no longer ihsan. That is now oppressive, because the nature of life has changed and the nature of human psychology has changed. ihsan, on the one hand, can be deeply philosophically complicated. But on the other hand, when it is lived and practiced, you very quickly, even the most naive philosophically, or the most uninitiated philosophically, very quickly realizes that ihsan is situational and relational. That if you read books of law, books of fiqh, and you pick what you find in these books, books that were written for a very different age and a very different time, and you become like a meme. You simply copy what you find in these books to living existence, and uncritically assume that whatever you find in these books that was once upon a time an embodiment of being beautifully good. But very quickly you discover that without major reconstruction and major rethinking and major intervention, what you find in these medieval books presented to our modern moment, to our contemporary society, do not embody ihsan and do not represent ihsan anymore. Relationally, people need a car, and you insist on offering them a camel. For those who are exotically minded, for those who exist in a self-imposed exoticism, they might find the gift of a camel very intriguing. And they might even engage you about the gift of a camel and pretend like giving them a camel in today's day and age is beautifully good. But beyond the exoticism of jurists and beyond the exoticism of the scholarly minded, in lived life, in the experience of life, a camel in our day and age is woefully inadequate, is thoroughly inapplicable, simply irrelevant. Now, the remarkable thing is that so many Muslims, as they develop their thinking, those who are committed to being Muslim, and those who grow up with a clear identity of being Muslim, are taught, in fact, not simply taught, but are conditioned to set their analytical faculties aside as they engage the modern world in relation to Islam. So if they are doctors, or if they are engineers, or if they are whatever profession that they are in, it is second nature to them that whatever defines good must be situationally relevant. So if they are a doctor, they understand that if a patient comes to them prescribing a course of honey and olive oil as a medicinal means would be irrelevant, would simply be non-responsive. They understand that in their profession, that in order to make a living, in order to engage society, they must do or engage the very principle of goodness in a way that is responsive to the principle of relevance. But when they engage the Islamic tradition, they are taught and conditioned to no longer see that society all around them is now dealing with cars and airplanes, but to somehow exoticize their thinking. And the minute they step into the realm of Islam, they start thinking in terms of camels and horses and donkeys. What I'm talking about is sweeping. It is relevant to everything. It is relevant to the way that we think about criminal law and Islam. In our day and age, we know a great deal about human testimony and human witnesses. We know a great deal about due process. We know a great deal about the independence of the judiciary. We know a great deal about the right of representation. All of that embodies or represents the car that you need in the modern age. If you think of Islamic criminal law and you do not engage Islamic criminal law in the epistemology of modern legality, then you are offering a camel to people when they need a car. Similarly, when it comes to everything that has to do with marriage and divorce, in this day and age, you find those who still think that it is within the rights that a man has the right to force his wife to have sex. Centuries ago, the way people understood sexual relations, the way people understood the principle of bodily integrity, the way people related to the rights of the physical body and the space that surrounds the physical body is very different than our senses about right and wrong today. There are still people who think in terms of whether a wife has a duty to obey her husband, even if the husband's demands are unreasonable. In fact, the very language of obedience between husband and wife, in the vast majority of situations and relations today, is no longer relevant and cannot possibly be ihsan. In fact, it is again like the camel in the day and age of motor vehicles. The very principle of ihsan relating to what is good within the context of human living and within the context of his historical moment demands that we de-exoticize Islam. It is not impressive that you can open up a medieval book of law and read it and regurgitate what you find in a medieval book of law. In fact, not only is it not impressive, but it is fundamentally counter to the obligation that Allah places on you to do what is beautifully good. Because you owe God an obligation. You owe yourself an obligation. You owe your people an obligation to understand the objectives of the law and to understand the reality of our modern age, and then to present the law in the garb of what is beautifully good in the context of the historical moment that we live in. But I want to get to even a more subtle point. When Allah told us to believe and then be beautifully good, Allah was speaking to you as a person, as an individual, in the same way that believing is an individual obligation. As Allah says, everyone is bound by their own accountability. That nothing comes between you and your accountability to God, before God. To be able to engage God's law and to think through God's law and to offer God's law in the most beautifully relevant way takes years of study, years of training, because the charge of speaking for God is weighty indeed. If you are unable to dedicate yourself, to commit yourself to all the rigorous demands of becoming a specialist in God's law, and not just a specialist who reads and regurgitates like a meme, but a specialist who is actually capable of understanding what God is instructing human beings to do and engaging these instructions and then representing these instructions in the most beautifully good way possible. That takes years of training and years of dedication and years of commitment. It takes years of silence. First and foremost, years of silence before you are qualified to speak. If you haven't been silently training in God's law for 15, 20 years, before you open your mouth and you start speaking about what God's law is, then you are in the wrong because you are not qualified. But the vast majority of people are not expected to be experts in Islamic law and not expected to be somehow representers of God's law or representatives of God's law. The command to be beautifully good is to you as an individual, as a simple, innate, intuitive human being. Every now and then, you might run into a situation where you need to know God's law. And when that happens, then you better find a truly qualified expert and consult with them about what God's law is. But as I said, a priori, ask yourself, is this an expert who offers people camels or who offers people what is relevant to their day and age? But for the vast majority of people, the charge is to be beautifully good. And I tell you, one of the things that deeply troubles me about Muslim youth, I can't tell you the number of times I get messages from Muslim youth who are presenting me with a list of legal issues that I know trouble them, bother them. And they're saying, well, how about this in Islamic law? And how about this in Islamic law? And how about that in Islamic law? And my response, these questions that you raise about law, are they relevant to actual problems that you encountered in life? So for instance, someone who's not even married and doesn't even have the prospects of marriage presents me with a list of questions, for instance, about alimony for divorced women. Are you planning to get married? And are you planning to get divorced after getting married? So you're thinking about alimony for divorced women? It is not an issue that is actually confronting you in life. But even further, are you studying to be a specialist in Islamic law? And 99% of the times, the answer is absolutely no on both counts. They are raising not questions of problems they actually encountered in life, and so they're looking for a solution. And they are actually not students of Islamic law, but they grow up thinking that their relation to Islam is to think of Islam's problems and to somehow resolve Islam's problems. Well, I might tell you, Islam doesn't have problems. Islam has problem people. Islam has interpreters who are problematic. And in order to engage the problematic interpreters of Islam, again, it requires years of study and dedication. In other words, what are you doing? You are taking on intellectual issues that are far greater than you are and far beyond the historical moment that you confront. None of this is either here or there. If your faith, if your iman is contingent on understanding the laws of divorce and marriage in Sharia, then you better rethink your faith. Because if your iman is based on impressions of legalities and legalese, then indeed you do not have any iman. Iman is a relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is a relationship with your maker. Your obligation is not to answer questions, the ideological challenges that you believe confront Islam. Your obligation is as an individual to be truly a muhsin in the way you carry yourself, in the way that you engage your world. Not too long ago, I was asked to speak to an association of Muslim lawyers. And in my speech to these young graduates of law school, I underscored the obligation that each individual carries to serve the Muslim Ummah by individual acts of beauty. That each of these lawyers represented the Muslim Ummah in their very existence. And I was struck by the extent to which these young Muslim graduates are ideologically defeated. It is as if either each one of them individually can act as the greatest imam of the age, or they are nothing at all. Let me tell you a story of how individual excellence can be manifested. Allah presents us with lessons and messages that are as powerful as revelation every day of our life. American, Australian, British forces in Iraq and Afghanistan committed war crimes and atrocities. As I mentioned before, it has proven impossible to get the United Nations to investigate any of the war crimes committed by United States, Britain, or Australia, or France, or so on. Because Western powers have consistently blocked any UN investigation or inquiry into these matters. Recently, there has been a great deal of attention about an Australian soldier called Ben Robert Smith. This Australian soldier is highly decorated. He was given the Victoria Cross. He was honored by the Australian leadership. He met the Queen and honored by the British royalty as well. He is heralded as Australia's war hero for acts of bravery during the Afghan War. Recently, however, it has come out that Ben Roberts-Smith, Australia's war hero, is a war criminal. That in Afghanistan, around 2012 and 2013, that same war hero, a member of SAS, Australia's Special Forces, which interestingly enough wears a cross in the front of their uniform, had committed atrocious war crimes in Afghanistan. In one such incident, for instance, he went during a raid, found an Afghani farmer who annoyed him. He threw that poor Afghani farmer off a cliff and then went to the man's broken body, he was still alive, and executed him. Other things came out that he executed another unarmed Afghani farmer and then used his prosthetic leg as a alcohol drinking instrument. They turned it into a wine cup of sorts in his unit. That there were some young Australians that joined the special forces under his command. They had not yet killed anyone. So in order to initiate them, do a blood initiation, he brought unarmed Afghani civilians and had them execute these civilians just so that they could experience the thrill of killing. Many other reports that this fellow, Ben Roberts-Smith, has executed and murdered unarmed civilians and villagers. Now, this was a war hero, someone who was the darling of the media. And in fact, after receiving all these military decorations, he was hired by an Australian millionaire called Kerry Stokes. Kerry Stokes is sort of a media mogul, and he hired this fellow, Ben Roberts-Smith, gave him a position, I'm not sure what position it was, but basically paying him a lot of money. How did the stories of the war crimes come out? Well, it was basically three amazingly beautiful journalists: Nick McKenzie, Chris Masters, and David Rowe. These three journalists started hearing rumors, including from locals in Afghanistan, the story of their heroism in investigating the war crimes committed by Ben Roberts-Smith are astounding and mind-boggling. For instance, Nick McKenzie flew to Afghanistan at a time when there was a very high risk that he would be caught and executed by the Taliban. This is right as Kabul was about to fall into the hands of the Taliban, but flew to Afghanistan to meet Afghani witnesses and talk to them firsthand about the war crimes committed by Ben Roberts-Smith. When Nick McKenzie and Chris Masters and David Rowe started publishing their articles about the SAS unit under Ben Roberts-Smith and the war crimes and the murders and the killing and the torture that they committed, all the Islamophobes, All the Australian nationalists absolutely hated these journalists and attacked them left and right, called them traitors, called them all types of horrible names and accusations. The three journalists said they had no big philosophical cause. The only thing that they were committed to is to uncover the truth. Why? Are you Muslim lovers? Are you apologists for Islamists? Are you Taliban sympathizers? None of the above. We are committed simply to the truth. Ben Robert Smith then sues these journalists. And contemplate this moment. When Ben Robert Smith sues the journalists, a millionaire, Kerry Stokes, tells Ben Robert Smith, I will pay for your lawsuit against these journalists, against these Muslim lovers. I will fund your lawsuit without limits. Well, it costed Kerry Stokes to fund Ben Robert Smith's lawsuit $16 million. He donated $16 million to defend a war criminal accused of murdering Muslims left and right. Just this week, a judge in Australia ruled against Ben Robert Smith. Why did he rule against Ben Robert Smith in his defamation lawsuit? Because the three journalists went as far as flying in witnesses from Afghanistan to come to Australia to render testimony. These three journalists went through unbelievable abuse as they tried to get Ben Robert Smith's comrades in his own SAS unit to become whistleblowers, to testify as to the massacres and murders they witnessed their commander commit. And it completely dedicated years of their life and went through unbelievable abuse. When you read the details, it's mind-boggling. But there's another hero in the story. The lawyer that represented the three journalists, that stood up to the type of legal team that $16 million can pay. And that lawyer, and unfortunately his name is skipping me right now, but that lawyer in this defamation lawsuit committed himself to proving that the defense against defamation is truth, and to present the court in Australia with evidence after evidence after evidence that in fact Ben Robert Smith was and is a war criminal and not a national hero. And I sat here contemplating the situation. Three journalists, not Muslim, not great talking heads about anything, but simply committed to the beautiful truth. Even if it means losing jobs, being persecuted, even if it means their families being slandered, their children being threatened at school. I contemplated this lawyer who stood against overwhelming political forces in Australia and said, I don't care what it takes I believe in the truth, and I will defend the three journalists because I am committed to what is beautifully true. But then I contemplated someone like Kerry Stokes, who donated $16 million to serve an unjust cause. And I thought of all the Muslims. Can I imagine a situation in which any of these rich American Muslims will donate $1 million to defend anything they believe in? What a world. Reflect upon this one example. This is what individual excellence means. Individual excellence is to be committed to doing what is beautifully good in your context, in the context that Allah presents you with. If you're a journalist, to speak the truth regardless of the cost. If you're a lawyer, to defend the truth regardless of the cost. I pray that Allah blesses these people, because for all the poor Afghani victims of this war criminal, no Muslim helped them. Ben Robert Smith murdered one of his victims, was a father of 7 children. Just one of his victims. He killed women and children, killed men for sport, orphaned droves of children in Afghanistan. No Muslim helped. But these 3 beautifully good journalists and this beautifully good lawyer did. That is what ihsan is. Don't pontificate. Don't go on social media and theorize about things you know you're not qualified to theorize about. It doesn't matter what these legal issues or those legal issues are. Pay attention to your situation. Excel in your situation. Be a representative of the beauty of Islam through your individual path. The Prophet ﷺ condemns in a hadith, famous hadith, al-mutafayqihun. Al-mutafayqihun are talking heads. Al-mutafayqihun are those who pretend to be legal experts for nothing but an act of pure egoism. They are not qualified. They have not studied law or legal thinking. They have not trained. And even if they trained, they are not adequately educated to be spokespeople for God. Al-mutafayqihun are people who, instead of putting their energy into excelling as a human being, into being like these journalists or like that lawyer, or like all the heroes that testified against Ben Robert Smith, regardless of the consequences and the blowback, instead of being like them, they spend their life pontificating about issues that they know nothing about. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم أسأل الله يستجيب لكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والحمد لله رب العالمين. وسبحان الله العلي العظيم والصلاة والسلام على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. You see, last khutbah I mentioned that human rights is the secular religion of our age. And it is completely true that the language by which dominant forces in the world today speak about what is good, what is beautifully good, and what is not, is all channeled through the medium of human rights, the linguistic medium of human rights and the institutional medium of human rights. Human rights have become the way that we talk about what is appropriate and what is inappropriate. It is so much so that any specialist who wants to think about ihsan in the modern age must master the history, the philosophy, the jurisprudence, the sources, the practices of human rights. Otherwise, you'll be the bearer of the camel. Otherwise, you are exotic and irrelevant. If you simply think that you can say, well, I'm not going to say anything about human rights, you're wrong. Because if you don't engage in the language of human rights, you are thoroughly irrelevant in our day and age. There is something about human rights, though. The theory of human rights, the philosophy of human rights, is truly universal and all-inclusive. The reality of human rights is something thoroughly different. Although, like the philosophy and theology of religion in the age of imperialism, colonial powers and imperial powers talked about the Christian faith as all-inclusive. Now, we don't talk about being bearers of the Christian faith. We talk about being bearers of human rights. Human rights, unfortunately, was born and continues to be deeply racist. From its inception to our very day, the institutions of human rights respond very differently when the victim is white, as opposed when the victim is dark-skinned. So, for instance, some of the worst conflicts of today and some of the locations of the worst abuses of human rights that are occurring today are in the Central African Republic, in the Republic of the Congo, in the heart of Africa, in other words. But because those who are dying and those who are being tormented and both who are being brutalized and those who are being sexually assaulted are dark-skinned, you hardly hear about it anywhere. You don't hear about the atrocities being committed in the Congo or in the Central Republic in the media. You don't hear about it in any public common discourse. Human rights, from its inception, showed a great degree of sensitivity to what concerns the white man and showed a remarkable obliviousness to those who are dark-skinned. But human rights is also racist in a different way. Human rights from the beginning has looked at Muslims and treated Muslims as an inferior category, hardly existing in the conscience of the world. Because the victors of World War II and the inventors of the human rights discourses thought of the world of Islam as the world of an old enemy, an old arch enemy, and as a world that they feared and that they considered inherently dangerous, but that at the same time saw as a thoroughly colonized and dominated and subordinated entity. That is why, since 1948, if you look at the pattern of human rights abuses and the responsiveness of the institutions of human rights, you will discover that the more Muslim a Muslim entity is seen to be, the more it is oblivious and out of the consciousness of the world of human rights. So it's not just blacks, but Muslims as well. Listen, millions were killed in Iraq, hundreds of thousands in Afghanistan. The world consciousness approaches the atrocities committed as an offense against the self-identity of a white man. So we condemn Ben Roberts, this Australian fellow, because he betrayed Australian and Western civilizational values. But it is rare indeed to find that any of the institutions of human rights, including courts, look at Muslims as inherently valuable or worthy. In other words, Muslims consistently, since World War II, have been utterly dispensable. If you are a Muslim that doesn't identify as a Muslim, then you're a human being. Then I engage you as a real reality. But if you're a Muslim who identifies as a Muslim, like for instance, poor Afghani farmers that every other word out of their mouths is Allah, or poor or Iraqi farmers or Iraqi workers who just pray and fast and every other word out of their mouths is Allah, they're hardly human. They are killed and no one even bothers counting how many are killed. Look at the way the world has dealt with Israeli exceptionalism since the establishment of the State of Israel. Just recently, we all read that the Netanyahu government is changing the administration of the West Bank to putting a civilian ministry in charge of the West Bank in clear violation of international law, because when Israel does that, that means that Israel considers the West Bank no longer occupied territory, but is effectively annexing the West Bank. A clear violation of the Geneva Conventions, a clear violation of international law. There's a law that is being passed in Israel that a bill that will restrict Palestinians from living in Jewish areas, that it would vet Palestinians and prevent them from buying land or renting apartments in areas where Jews live. Israel revives the E1 settlement project. This is a project that initially, years ago, was proposed by the Netanyahu government to effectively displace Palestinians, evict Palestinians out of major areas in the West Bank and resettle them in ghetto areas where they can be easily controlled. Just last week, and I'm just reading headlines. Israeli army seriously wounds a journalist in a Ramallah raid. Israeli army attacks Aqaba Jabr camp in latest Israeli deadly attack. The Palestinian toddler shot by Israeli dies, Muhammad Tamimi, this child, just died. Israel proposes a plan, again in violation of international law, dividing Al-Aqsa Mosque between Muslims and Jews. Now, even a news item like this, Israel sent arms to Myanmar, to Burma, in violation of international law, because Burma is responsible for the Rohingya genocide, the genocide against Muslims, the Rohingya Muslims. So the United Nations passed a resolution saying no one should sell arms or give arms either to Myanmar because they are criminals. This government is responsible for a genocide. Israel, it turns out, continued, even after this resolution, continued to provide arms to Myanmar so it can slaughter Muslims, slaughter the Rohingya Muslims. The story of Israeli exceptionalism, despite the fact that they are a consistent and persistent violation of international law, consistent and persistent violators of human rights, the world hardly cares. And what I submit to you is that the world hardly cares because the victims are Muslims. And wherever the victims are Muslims, you will find that the world hardly cares. But what is even worse is we've reached a stage where Muslim governments themselves no longer expect the world to honor the life of Muslims. So Israel can do all that it does, murder Palestinians, annex the Aqsa Mosque, annex the West Bank, kill toddlers, and yet, with a complete straight face, Morocco continues negotiating with Israel for Israel to allow Morocco to annex the Sahara. It is mind-boggling. Israel is nowhere near where Morocco is. Why does Morocco need Israel permission to annex adjacent territory? This whole conflict in the Western Sahara Desert is a long story. But what is mind-boggling is that Morocco understands that the world will allow it to annex this territory in violation of international law as long as Israel gives the green light. And that is why Morocco is negotiating with Israel about territory adjacent to Morocco. Israel can do whatever it does And yet, with a straight face, the Biden administration continues talking about all the cooperation and peace possibilities between Saudi Arabia and Israel. The whole world expects, the whole world understands that when it comes to Muslims, Muslims hardly care if you murder fellow Muslims. Okay. So, human rights has always been bound to dark skin, has always been responsive to the interests of the white race, but largely blind when the victims are blacks. But what we must also recognize, that human rights have also been blind when the victims are Muslims. And human rights is the language of our age, the secular, religious language of our age. So what to do? Well, there is no possible way to fulfill the meaning of ihsan in our day and age without mastering the language of human rights and without returning the gaze to human rights and without the victim that is oblivious to the field of human rights. In other words, that subject that is hardly noticed by the world of human rights, you cannot change that reality unless that subject learns to engage that language and force the gaze of human rights to take account of that subject. It's not going to happen through the Saudi government. If you're waiting for the Saudi government to do this for you, it will never happen. If you're waiting for the Saudi government to make you human before, in the eyes of human rights, that will not happen. If you're waiting for the Emirati government, it will not happen. If you're waiting for the Egyptian government, it will not happen. If you're waiting for the American government, it will not happen. If you're waiting for the British government, the Australian government, if you're waiting for the Chinese government, the Russian government, it will not happen. None of these are going to humanize you in the eyes of human rights. You, whether you like it or not, are in the same category of blacks in the eyes of human rights. Even if quite often critical race theorists ignore the reality that Muslims are in the same level of obliviousness and necropolitics. So if it will not happen, no government is going to humanize you in the eyes of human rights. There's only one more option left, and that's you. You can humanize you in the eyes of human rights. You can be a Nick McKenzie. You can be the brave journalist that takes on the world and fights the honorable fight and wins. You can be the lawyer that represented these journalists and took on the world and is now, whether the lawyer realizes or not, has entered the annals of human rights. You can be, as an individual who excels, who does what is beautifully good, and who forces the world to take account of him or her as a Muslim, as a Muslim, we can force the world to acknowledge our humanity, but we will not do it by signing idiotic statements that make idiotic points, or by pontificating about the awra of women, or the hijab of women, or all the silly, nonsensical things that Muslims go on and on about, instead of excelling as examples of excellent, beautiful human beings. May Allah help you to be beautifully good, to be true to yourself, true to your God, true to your religion. Allahumma aghfir lana, Allahumma afu anna, Allahumma arhamna ya arhamar rahimin. Allah, forgive our sins. Allah, guide us to Iman, guide us to Ihsan, guide us to beauty, guide us to excellence, guide us to be good, moral human beings, to represent your faith well, to live a beautiful life and die a beautiful death, and to be among those who are nearest to you in the hereafter. Ya Rabb al-Alameen. صلي وسلم وبارك على محمد وآله وأصحابه يا رب العالمين. واقم الصلاة.